Pam Pitts was a young woman full of life and promise. Born on June 25, 1969, at K.I. Sawyer Air Force Base in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, she was the eldest of 4 siblings. Pam had an outgoing nature and a tight-knit circle of friends. Among her many interests, she was particularly fascinated by CB radios, using the handle Dark Angel whenever she communicated. Her friends and family knew her as a spirited and independent woman, always seeking adventure but still deeply connected to her loved ones. In June of 1988, at the age of 19, Pam moved out of her family home to live with her best friend, Shelley Norgard, despite her father's objections. He had tried to convince her otherwise, reminding her that she had her room and a private entrance at home, but Pam was determined to experience independence. However, financial difficulties quickly arose, leading them to take in a third roommate, Jeremy Anderson, to help cover the rent. For a while, everything seemed to be working out. The 3 roommates appeared to get along well, and Pam continued working at her job while staying connected with her family. But trouble began to surface. Pam started to feel uneasy about her living situation, and over dinner with her father one evening, she confided to him that the rent was falling behind. She was frustrated and admitted she was considering moving back home. Her father, Paul Pitts, immediately supported the decision, telling her that she was always welcome. They discussed logistics, and Pam mentioned that she would visit the house on Saturday to do her laundry. It was the last time Paul Pitts would ever see his daughter alive. When Monday came, Pam failed to show up for work, prompting her father to call her employer. Upon learning that she hadn't been to work, panic set in. Paul immediately contacted the police and went with a sergeant, Bill Hoggs, to Pam's house. Shelley Norgard answered the door, but her behavior raised suspicions. Inside, all of Pam's personal belongings, including her purse, driver's license, and medication, were still there, yet there was no sign of her. When questioned, Shelley casually suggested that Pam had gone out partying, showing little concern for her disappearance. She also revealed that she and Pam had a joint checking account for rent payments. According to Shelley, Pam had recently withdrawn all the money, leaving the account empty and causing financial strain. Shelley was upset about the situation, but there was nothing to indicate where Pam had gone. Days passed without any leads, and then a gruesome discovery shattered the town. In a secluded, wooded area known as Gordo's Pit, a local hangout for parties, someone sifting through refuse spotted something horrific, a human foot protruding from a pile of garbage. The police arrived at the scene to find a burned, unrecognizable body. Among the charred remains, investigators found melted metal fused into the wrist bones, a bracelet with faint, barely legible letters. Dark Angel. It was Pam. The brutality of her murder stunned the investigators. Pam's body had been discarded like trash, set on fire to destroy evidence, and left in a pit where local kids often gathered. Detectives quickly turned their attention to her roommates, Shelley and Jeremy, questioning them about their whereabouts on the night of September 16th, the last time Pam had been seen alive. Jeremy had an alibi. He was at a football game and later hung out with friends, which was confirmed. Shelley stated that she had worked that night, picked up her boyfriend, Ray Clare, and they spent the evening together until about 2:30 a.m. When questioned, Ray corroborated her story and even took a polygraph test, which he passed. With no evidence tying either of them to the crime, Pam's case went cold. Years passed without answers. Pam's father, Paul, remained persistent, hoping for justice, but as time went on, the updates from law enforcement became infrequent. Then, in an unexpected twist, another shocking murder reawakened the case. A group of Embry-Riddle students exploring an abandoned mine on Iron Springs Road stumbled upon a decomposing body in a vertical mine shaft. The victim was positively identified as Ray Clare, Shelley Norgard's former boyfriend. He had been shot in the head and dumped in the shaft. Investigators immediately turned their focus to Shelley. A forensic search of her home revealed traces of blood, and a disturbing discovery was made in her car, the unmistakable odor of decomposition. Blood found in the trunk matched Ray's, and a 9mm Luger revolver was recovered from under the front seat. Ballistics tests later confirmed it was the same type of weapon used to kill Ray. With mounting evidence, police charged Shelley with Ray's murder. She maintained her innocence for 2 years before finally confessing. She admitted to killing Ray in the apartment, storing his body in her car, and later transporting it using a borrowed truck to dump him in the mine. She was sentenced to 20 years without parole, though she received credit for the 2 years already served. Shelley's conviction cast her in a new light. If she had murdered Ray, could she have also killed Pam? Shelley served her sentence and was released in 2011. But the questions surrounding Pam's murder never faded. Investigators turned to recorded phone calls between Shelley and her father from her time in prison. The conversations were tense, with her father repeatedly referencing that night in a way that suggested a shared secret. During one call, as Shelley spoke about Pam, the line suddenly went silent, almost as if she had realized she had said too much. This prompted investigators to seek an indictment. Shelley was confronted once more, and under legal pressure, she finally admitted to killing Pam Pitts. According to her confession, she was furious about the overdrawn checking account and Pam's plans to move out, which would leave her unable to afford rent. On the night of September 16th, Shelley went looking for Pam and found her at Gordo's pit. A confrontation turned violent, and in a fit of rage, Shelley repeatedly punched Pam until she stopped breathing. Hearing voices approaching, she fled the scene, leaving Pam's lifeless body behind. However, there were still unanswered questions. Shelley never explained who burned Pam's body or why it had been set on fire. Investigators suspected she had help, or that someone else had stumbled upon the body and attempted to destroy the evidence, but there was no way to prove it. With Shelley's confession, a plea deal was arranged. She would be convicted of Pam's murder, but sentenced to time already served, ensuring that her record permanently reflected her crimes. For Pam's family, it was a bittersweet resolution. They had sought justice for decades, and though they would have preferred a harsher sentence, they knew that securing a conviction was the most important outcome. Paul Pitts, who had fought tirelessly for his daughter, accepted the deal despite criticism. In his words, it was more important to get the confession and the conviction behind Shelley's name than it was for the time. However, he made his feelings about Shelley clear. If it were up to me, she'd be in prison for the rest of her life. My advice to her husband, sleep with one eye open. Shelley Harmon, formerly Shelley Norgard, walked free, having been convicted of 2 murders but serving only the time for one. To this day, many believe she never told the full truth about what happened to Pam Pitts that night, and while justice was finally recorded, the full story may never be known. Michael Temple was the kind of man who left a lasting impression on everyone he met. He was kind, hard-working, and fiercely loyal to the people he loved. Born and raised in Anne Arundel County, Maryland, Michael grew up passionate about cars. He had a natural talent for fixing things, and there was rarely a day when his hands weren't covered in grease from working on an engine. His family and friends often joked that he was more comfortable under the hood of a car than anywhere else. In high school, Michael met Margaret, the woman who would become the love of his life. They met on a blind date when Margaret was in her junior year, and despite their age difference, Michael was 3 years older, and the connection between them was instant. Margaret was drawn to his charm, his intelligence, and the way he treated her with such tenderness. He was the kind of guy who would carry her purse without hesitation, a small but meaningful gesture that showed just how much he cared. Michael had big plans for the future. He was considering working alongside his father in construction, a career that would provide him with stability and allow him to put his mechanical skills to good use. He and Margaret were building a life together, and everything seemed to be falling into place. But on a cold winter night, everything changed. It was supposed to be a normal evening. Michael and Margaret had just returned home after celebrating Margaret's mother's birthday. They were in good spirits, enjoying the warmth of their home as the winter wind howled outside. Their friend Kelly had stopped by, needing to use their computer for a money transfer. The three of them headed to the basement, making sure not to disturb Margaret's grandmother, who was asleep upstairs, or her uncle, who was watching TV in the living room. Moments later, there was a knock at the door. Michael, always one to greet visitors without hesitation, went to answer it. But as he opened the door, the glint of metal caught his eye, a gun barrel forcing its way through the small opening. Within seconds, two masked men burst into the house, their weapons drawn, their voices sharp with aggression. Everything happened so fast. The intruders ordered Michael to open the safe, but he refused. Even when they turned their threats on Margaret, he stood firm. The situation escalated quickly, and Margaret's instinct to fight kicked in. She struggled against one of the intruders, clawing and pushing with everything she had. But he was stronger. He struck her over the head with the butt of his gun, the impact sending her reeling. Stars flashed before her eyes, but she refused to give up. Then gunshots. At first, she thought it was something else, maybe pots and pans crashing together in the kitchen. But the sound was unmistakable. When the intruder she was fighting suddenly fled, she rushed to check on Michael. He was on the ground near the back door, blood pooling around him. A gunshot wound to the chest, another to the thigh. He was struggling to breathe, but even in his weakened state, he managed to whisper, "I stabbed him." He repeated it over and over, his voice fading with each breath. Kelly ran upstairs and called 911, but by the time paramedics arrived, Michael was barely conscious. He was rushed to the hospital, his injuries severe. He fought to stay alive, enduring countless surgeries and setbacks. Margaret stayed by his side, watching the man she loved slip further away. For a year, Michael battled for his life, but with every passing day, his strength faded. The once lively, ambitious man she knew was disappearing before her eyes. The seizures, the complications, it all became too much. One day he told Margaret that she needed to leave, to find her own path. She didn't want to, but she knew he was right, and so she walked away, carrying with her the unbearable weight of a love that was slipping through her fingers. Years passed, and Michael never recovered. The light in his eyes dimmed, and eventually it went out for good. When Margaret reached out to his friend Chris, desperate for news, she was met with the devastating truth. Michael had passed away. His funeral had already happened, and she wasn't even allowed to say goodbye. For years the case went cold. Without an immediate arrest, the investigation lost momentum. But everything changed when the autopsy confirmed that Michael's death was a direct result of the injuries he sustained during the home invasion. What had once been an assault case was now a murder investigation, and with that shift, the urgency to solve the case was reignited. Detectives combed through the evidence, determined to find the men responsible. They had a trail of blood leading from the crime scene to a nearby light pole, suggesting that one of the attackers had been wounded, just as Michael had said. Witnesses reported seeing a silver truck speeding away from the scene, but leads were scarce. The case took a breakthrough turn when forensic experts introduced a new tool, phenotyping, a cutting-edge DNA analysis technique that could generate a suspect's appearance based on their genetic profile. Using blood left on the knife Michael had used to stab his attacker, investigators created a computer-generated portrait of the killer. The sketch was haunting. The most striking feature? His eyes. For years the image circulated, but no solid leads emerged. That was until investigators turned to reverse genetic genealogy, a method that allowed them to work forward in time, tracing family connections until they landed on one name, Fred Frampton Jr. Everything fit. He lived in the area. He was the right age. His eyes matched the sketch perfectly. He had a silver truck registered in his name, and, most damning of all, he legally owned a .357, a gun that matched the casings found at the scene. When police arrested Frampton, his confidence crumbled. As soon as he realized they had his DNA, he confessed. He admitted to shooting Michael, but insisted the home invasion wasn't his idea. According to Frampton, it was orchestrated by his friend Jonathan Ludwig, who had once been a client of Michael and Margaret's. Ludwig had known about the safe and assumed there was money and drugs inside, but justice would never fully be served. Ludwig had died of a drug overdose months earlier, escaping the consequences of his crime. That left Frampton to face the music alone. The most shocking revelation came when Michael's father, who had continued to work in construction, learned the horrifying truth. He had unknowingly worked side by side with his son's killer for years. He had trained both Frampton and Ludwig, never realizing that they had been responsible for the attack that ultimately took his son's life. The betrayal was almost too much to bear. Frampton was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. The courtroom was filled with emotion as Margaret, Michael's family, and friends finally saw justice served. Though it had taken years, Michael's story was no longer a cold case. His fight, his bravery, and his final act of defiance, stabbing his attacker, ultimately led to his killer's capture. As Frampton was led away in handcuffs, he had nothing left to say. His family struggled to comprehend how someone they knew could be capable of such a brutal act. But for Michael's loved ones, the relief was bittersweet. Justice had come, but it couldn't bring him back. Even now, years later, Michael Temple's story serves as a reminder of the strength of the human spirit. He fought. He protected the people he loved, and in the end he helped solve his own murder. His legacy lives on, not just in the justice that was served, but in the people who will never forget the man he was. And in the eyes of a killer, the truth was finally revealed. On a warm summer night in 1970, 4-year-old Heidi Jones lay in bed, her small body nestled under the covers as her mother, 24-year-old Loretta Jones, tucked her in. The young single mother was raising Heidi in the quiet town of Price, Utah, doing her best to provide a safe and loving home. That evening, something about her mother's demeanor felt different. Before stepping out of the room, Loretta turned back and looked at her daughter with an unusual seriousness. "Don't come out," she instructed Heidi. It wasn't a request, it was a firm command. Heidi, still half asleep, nodded. What else could a 4-year-old do? She didn't question her mother, and she obeyed. The next morning, the sun poured through the windows, signaling a new day, but something felt wrong. The house was eerily quiet. Heidi, still in her bedroom, slowly opened her door, peering through the dimly lit hallway. As she stepped into the front room, she was met with a scene that no child should ever have to witness. Her mother lay motionless on the floor. There was blood on the couch, the floor, the walls. The room was a mess of violence, but Heidi didn't cry. She didn't scream. A part of her young mind understood something terrible had happened, even if she couldn't process it fully. Confused and afraid, Heidi wandered out onto the front porch. A neighbor, an older man, was outside digging in the dirt for worms. Spotting her standing alone, he looked up and smiled. "Heidi, come here. I have to show you something." But Heidi shook her head. Her voice, small but certain, cut through the morning air. "I can't. I think my mom is dead." Police arrived at the house shortly after, and what they discovered inside horrified even the most seasoned detectives. Loretta Jones had been brutally murdered. She had been sexually assaulted, stabbed twice in the chest, and then viciously stabbed 17 more times in the back. There was even an attempt to slit her throat. The sheer brutality of the attack suggested rage, something personal, but what puzzled investigators was the lack of forced entry. No broken windows and no signs of struggle at the door. It appeared that whoever had killed Loretta had been invited inside. Investigators meticulously searched the crime scene, gathering evidence. They collected fingerprints, fibers, and blood samples, but there was little to point to a definitive suspect. Meanwhile, Heidi, now under the care of her grandparents, was questioned by detectives. They gently asked if she had heard or seen anything that night. Her young mind struggled to piece together the fragments of memory. "I know something is trapped in my brain," she would later recall. "I believe it was too traumatic for me to remember." Yet, there was one thing she knew with absolute certainty. "Tom did it," she told her grandmother. "Tom killed my mom." The name was chilling in its simplicity. Tom. No last name, no description, just a name. But a name that Heidi repeated with unwavering certainty. Investigators scoured through Loretta's life, searching for any Tom she may have known. Then, on August 1st, a call came into the sheriff's office. The tipster urged them to investigate a man named Tom Egley, a railroad worker. It turned out Loretta had gone on a blind date with him once, but she hadn't been interested. She had wanted nothing to do with him, and yet her daughter's memory pointed straight to him. At the time of the murder, Tom Egley had been living in a motel in Helper, Utah, with his girlfriend, who was 8 months pregnant. Investigators brought him in for questioning, and he offered a carefully crafted alibi. He claimed he had hitched a ride with 2 teenagers that night, grabbed a burger from a fast food restaurant in Price, and later ended up at the Highway Rendezvous Bar around 11 p.m. or 11:30 p.m., but witnesses at the bar recalled his odd behavior. He was jittery and nervous, and the bar owner distinctly remembered seeing red specks on his shirt. When asked about them, Tom casually said he had been painting. Police searched his motel room, collecting a pair of Levi's jeans and a shirt he claimed to have worn that night. Forensic analysis revealed that carpet fibers from his clothing matched fibers from Loretta's living room rug. It was circumstantial, but it was something. Based on this, he was arrested. During the preliminary hearing, prosecutors presented what little evidence they had: witness testimonies, the fiber match, and Heidi's consistent identification. But the defense argued that Tom had been inside Loretta's home before, meaning the fiber evidence wasn't conclusive proof of his presence that night. With no physical evidence tying him directly to the murder and no confession, the judge ruled there wasn't enough to proceed to trial. Tom Egley walked free. For decades, Loretta's case remained unsolved. The horror of that night faded into silence. But Heidi never forgot. She grew up carrying the weight of an unproven truth. Then, years later, a shocking new piece of evidence surfaced. A woman came forward claiming she had seen something no one had ever mentioned before. Loretta had written her killer's name in blood. The woman had been living with Heidi's grandmother at the time of the murder. She recalled that the day after the crime, she and one of Loretta's sisters were allowed inside the house to collect some of Heidi's belongings. On the blood-stained floor, she saw letters written in blood. T and O. It was as if Loretta had tried to name her killer but had been too weak to finish. With this new revelation, the case was reopened, but investigators needed more. That's when Lisa Carter, a woman who had once known Tom Egley, agreed to go undercover. She befriended him, gained his trust, and subtly steered their conversations toward Loretta's murder. Then one night, Tom confessed. He spoke about the night in chilling detail. He had knocked on Loretta's door, and she let him in. Then he attacked. When Lisa pressed further, asking if he had assaulted Loretta, his response was void of remorse. "Yeah, of course I had sex with her," he said. "It was consensual." When she challenged him, "Tom, you stabbed her." How was that consensual? Зрение, его ответ был даже холоднее. She didn't tell me no. With this confession, law enforcement finally had the evidence they needed. After 46 years, justice had caught up with Tom Egley. In court, when given the chance to speak, he simply shrugged. "I'm sorry I killed her," he said. "I'm surprised you're doing something about it after 46 years. For Loretta's family, the pain of those lost years could never be erased. But finally, the truth had been recognized, and her murderer was held accountable. Some crimes may go unsolved for decades, but the truth has a way of finding the light, and for Heidi, the little girl who had never stopped believing, that moment had finally arrived.